evening. It is now 2 a.m. in Los Angeles. I'm not sure what this Hebrew character is, but it looks like me in front of a computer at my desk right now. So I'm the one. No, that one. Enjoyed reading this paper. That's it. Now we'll do it. Our CEO is paid extra for pay. Theory, I put that in quotes, saying why it says that risk-averse CEOs will demand compensating differentials for taking pay. So if you think about this equation, I should have used lambda, I used beta, but we would think that beta should be positive. But estimating beta requires estimates for both expected pay and the variance of pay, which turns out not to be trivial. So as Rui said, they use 3 different mentions. He spent most of the time talking about the simulations, also looking at the actual data for variances, or looking at this arch data. I want to talk about each of those in a little bit. The findings are that the beta is positive under all 3 approaches, but beta seems a little bit too low to be explained by theory, which suggests that our theories need a little updating. So I want to talk about this and try to do it in 12 minutes. So. Here's a fundamental problem with the paper. I put fundamental in quotes. Is they start off by saying a fundamental hypothesis of moral hazard is that risk-averse CEOs require extra pay for riskier pay packages. Well, first I want to ask if that's really fundamental to agency theory, or is it just convenient modeling? And we got into past dependence's historical rut. So agency theory is about the conflicts of interest between principals and agents. Modelers early on needed to have some sort of solution to rule out the trivial solution of just selling the firm to the worker. So you need some differences in preferences across those players. Oh, risk aversion kind of worked. I don't know that even they took it. If I go back to Ross or Holmstrom or Milgram, or I don't even know that they took it that seriously at the time, but it's sort of grown to the place where we think that this is the fundamental problem in agency theory. But no, the fundamental problem is the conflict of interest and how we might solve it. Another fundamental hypothesis in the sense that is born out of participation constraint. Well, whoever said that CEOs are paid to their participation constraint? Again, it was a modeling convenience, but if you think about the way to do agency theory, I can maximize firm profits subject to incentive compatibility constraint and a participation constraint. But if you look at some of the earlier models, I could also maximize, I figured out the optimal contract by maximizing the CEO's utility, expected utility subject to incentive compatibility and say a zero profit constraint. That's what Lazare and Rosen did. If you look at Jensen Meckley, and their assumption is that that the agent bears all the costs. All the agency costs, not shareholders, but it's actually the owner-manager who bears the cost. So there's nothing written in stone that says we're going to peg CEOs to a participation constraint. I can also think of the fact that there's a bid-ask spread for CEOs. We're going to be somewhere between those, but we don't necessarily have to be pegged at the participation constraint, and that might change some of our inferences. The approach on the simulations, if I think about the 4 kinds of compensation they really look at, there's non-equity incentives, bonuses. They look like this. There's a threshold, there's a cap. We can be linear, quadratic, concave, convex between those 2, but it looks something like that. We have restricted stock. Now this is an interesting one that they just sort of dismiss. They exclude it. You can't. It's really important, and it's really easy. Right? Restricted stock is just a linear contract. There's no accounting measures in there. It's just linear with stock price. Stock options. As you found out, there's only a handful of stock options in the sample that have performance criteria. It's just linear in stock price. And then there's these funny things called performance shares, which have become the dominant form of compensation given ISS, at least over the last 10 years or so. And they tend to look like the bonus contracts here, except for the denominated number of shares as opposed to in stock price. If I look at this simulation, over some questions, over 90% of the firms use adjusted or non-GAAP measures. I'm not sure how your simulation, I'm sure your simulations can affect that because they don't usually give enough information about what you would do with it. But the question is, how do those non-GAAP adjustments affect the variance of the bonuses? Some would argue that they put the adjustments in there to reduce the variance. Most firms have individual performance modifiers, which again could could modify the variance of the bonuses that are seen. The methodology, as far as I can tell, doesn't capture this tendency to get to this threshold no matter what. You know, wherever you put it, they'll do whatever they take, they'll lie, cheat, and steal to get to that threshold, because they get half of their bonus if they get to that threshold. There's also a lot of missing values for the goals, for the performance goals. This isn't random. It's ex post that firms decide whether or not they report their performance goals. And they're less likely to report them if they didn't make them. And if they don't have the performance goals, we throw them out of the sample. Restricted stock seems the easiest one. We know a lot more about the distribution of future stock prices than we know about the distribution of versus sales or EPS or anything else. So if I'm right that you just ignore these time-lapse restricted stocks, even throw them out of the clean sample, you can fix that. And I think that's sort of important to do. Stock options, same thing is we can compute, given the distribution of stock prices, which I don't think you use, but we could from there compute what the distribution, oh, you use that, okay. Performance shares, again, number of shares is on the axis. These are tough. They actually look something more like this when you put in the dollar value here, right? Because as performance goes up, not only do you get more shares, but the stock price is going up. So those are challenging to dictate, which is why some of the papers that you talked about that I wrote, I just ignore these. Luckily, it was back in a time when these things weren't that important, so they're difficult. So those are the simulations. Alternative number two, you didn't talk about it much today, but I'll just say, you look at the variance of TDC1. TDC1 is not the right variable because, of course, TDC1 has realized bonuses, but it has just the grant date value of options and restricted stock. And to find out what the variance of pay is, you've got to look at what's the variance of pay based on the potential distribution of stock prices, and not just sort of whatever Black-Scholes shows us is. I just gave an example here. If I have one CEO that always gets $1 million in straight bonus, another CEO that gets $1 million worth of stock every year, that's the only difference. I think you would compute that both would have variance of TDC1 of 0, because they both get $1 million year after year after year, but obviously CEO number 2 there has a riskier pay package than CEO number 1. So you can tell me whether we're having that. TDC1, mean of TDC1 is not really expected pay. You could have used a target bonus instead of the actual bonus. That would get a little bit closer, and just admit the fact that Black-Scholes is not meant to be a measure of expected pay unless the CEOs are perfectly hedging away the risk of the option and things about which we know they can't do. Approach number 3 is Arch. I don't have much to say about that because you're right, this is brand new to CEO pay. I'm really intrigued by it, but it's not really discussed exactly how you do it. I think it's still based on TDC1 somehow, which is problematic. So gamma, which is risk aversion in the paper, I think I'm confused reading the paper about sometimes you refer to it as absolute risk aversion, which it is in the old models, the exponential utility. But then you discuss, somehow you converted that to relative risk aversion. I don't know how you do that because you can't do that without a measure of outside wealth, and there's nothing in the proxy statements that would give us outside wealth, which is why I plugged for the paper I gave before, while I was sort of excited about having some plausible measure. I think what you've done is you've underestimated what the variance of pay is. I think that's going to make your results even stronger in the sense that it doesn't look like CEOs are rewarded enough for the risky compensation that they have. So let me end. Talk fast enough. Just with something that I think is intriguing. So if you look at the 90s, for example, this is when we had the big growth in stock prices, right? We tripled compensation in real terms, mostly through stock options. Well, I looked at this data hard, and there was maybe there's some theoretical arguments people have tried to make, but basically this was just companies layering stock options on top of what they already had. If that's what's going on, if we're just layering risky pay on top of already competitive pay, you shouldn't get a risk premium for that. Now that's like if your dean says, well, in addition to your salary, I'm just going to give you $10,000 worth of lottery tickets, and you go bang on his door and say, well, then you better raise my salary because you've just made my pay a lot riskier. Well, that doesn't make any sense, but it's a violation of It's because he's not pegging you to the participation constraint. And so if this is true, pay will go up, risk will go up, but it's not a compensating differential for risk. It's something else. And so I'll tell you about an experiment I did. I should put some of this in a accounting coming out soon, but just looked at the change in total pay over the change in new equity grant. I'm saying you're getting a restricted stock grant for the first time in 4 years, or you're getting an option for the first time in 4 years, you're getting performance shares for the first time in 4 years, and asking the question, what happens to your total pay? At risk neutrality, we would expect that beta was 0, right? That we would expect if you get $1,000 more in options, something else will go down by $1,000, your pay would stay the same, given that we're controlling for everything else that should be based on pay. If you're risk averse, we'd expect beta to be somewhere between 0 and 1, but we'd probably expect beta to be smaller for a restricted stock because that's the less risky, higher for options and performance shares because those are riskier. What you actually find is every time I give you $1 more restricted shares, controlling for everything else I know how to control for, pay goes up by about $1.50. Stock options and performance shares, pay goes up by $1. In other words, when you add these new performance plans, I can't find any evidence that they're actually taken away from anything else. And if they're not taken away from anything else, we're fine. We'll get a positive beta, your beta, right? We'll get a positive relation between expected pay and variance, but it has nothing to do with the participation constraint.
Thank you. You over time, but I was fascinated.
Yeah, and this is the last thing. Well, you never held up the one that's in 1 minute.
Well,
I was waiting for that. Okay.
1 minute.
Don't take the model too seriously. That's it.
Thank you. If anybody has some more questions, of course, I should have 1 minute more in each conference for your question.
No, so this is related to Kevin's discussion, where he was saying companies are just layering more things on more things. I think Lucian Bebchuk has some evidence that do we have full disclosure of all the forms of compensation before we get SEC rules? My push is going to be on the big explosion in pay in the 1990s is Congress says in the US, you can't go over $1 million in straight salary, or you can, but it's very expensive. So companies discover this new thing of, oh, let's give options instead, right? And can you model pay when we've got a binding constraint, effectively binding, set by the government on what pay has to look at? And I think you have to. You have to build that into your model of pay to say, if you want to go over $1 million, it has to be in the following form. Maybe there are market reasons for going above $1 million. Maybe not. But in any event, I think you have to build into your model there's a binding constraint. You can't go over $1 million in straight salary. Otherwise, you're not modeling what people are doing.
Okay, you care to respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, Kevin. I mean, as I said, there was a much longer list of comments that Kevin said, and this is very much still work in progress. If you read the paper, you'll see that. So these great comments will be in the paper at some point. And we'll do the restricted stock, the non-performance restricted stock. So that's important. What I want to make clear here, and this also goes to Bernie's question, is that we try to make the exercise as tight as possible. Okay, so there's many different models that would generate quasi-similar predictions. Okay, but there's models that people have used to, like let's say you want to test the sensitivity of pay to variance of pay, for example. That comes from these models. So all of that literature is this setting. So we want to test one hypothesis that comes from this literature, even before you come with all the hypotheses that's needed to generate the predictions that would lead to how does pay for performance relate to firm risk. Okay? And so that's the goal of this very tight, very narrow exercise. all right? So of course we could build other things to try to explain what exactly people are doing. That's not exactly what we're going to do, not at this stage at least, okay? I think we want to move that way. But at this stage we want to keep it very tight. We want to say, okay, so there's a big literature that departs from this model. And so that's why we want to very narrowly look down at this model and ask, one very important question. And we don't find, significant evidence towards that hypothesis. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do here, right? I mean, we're obviously aware that there's, a ton of literature that was developed after Grossman and Hart, and I think that people kind of need to. I think the message from this paper is that we need to go precisely on other routes that are not restricted to that model, to that setting, either because it's very narrowly down to risk diversification story that doesn't apply anymore, or maybe never did, or whatever it is the reason. But I mean, that diversification story is a fundamental hypothesis of many papers that people have written, and we're kind of trying to say that maybe those papers are flawed in a way that they're tied to a risk story that doesn't really apply. So that's kind of the goal here. But I mean, I think we want to move to what exactly then explains this, and maybe it is that this constraint that Kevin and others have highlighted that prevents people from expensing salary over $1 million, and then of course has shifted, made companies shift to other kinds of pay that carry more incentives and more risk. So maybe that's what it is, and so maybe that's what we're going to be looking into.
That was my reaction, was that story where the flat salary is capped at $1 million helps to explain your results.
Yeah, so we're going to get there eventually. But,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, the story itself helps, but whether quantitatively is significant enough, we don't have an answer to that.
Next is Kyong.
Thank you, Roy. Thanks, Anna. Anna, you want to say something?